Welcome back to our Life Group Bible study on the book of Matthew. Tonight we're in chapter 24, which is kind of a unique chapter. Instead of dealing with a lot of Jesus' parables or just telling the story of Jesus' disciples or even Jesus going off on the Pharisees, this chapter deals almost entirely with prophecy. So it has a very different feel to it. So let's go ahead and dive right into this chapter and see what there is to see. Verse 1, as Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings. But he responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" All right, I got to pause right here. First, I want you to envision this scene. The disciples have come to the temple, and this temple was immaculate. It was a modern wonder at the time. King Solomon started the temple and had it, and it was beautiful when he created it. But King Herod had made a number of additions and added lots of gold plating and built it up really just lavishly. And so when the disciples come and see this temple, they are in awe. I mean, they just can't believe the architecture of it, the beauty, the wealth of it. And Jesus sees this awe and wonder that they're looking at, and he knows what's going to happen in the future. And he says, "I tell you the truth, that not one stone will be on top of each other." He prophesied that the temple would be destroyed. So then he goes, and they're sitting down, and the disciples come around him, and they ask him a question. But they don't ask just one question, they ask two questions. And this is what they ask: "Tell us when this all will happen." And then they follow it up: "What sign will signal your return in the end of the world?" Now, in their minds, these two things were the one and the same. So the same time that the temple was going to be destroyed was going to be the end of the world and the Messiah's return. So that's what's going on in their minds. But what they actually ask are two very different questions. When will this happen, the destruction of the temple? And when will the end times come? And when will you return? And so Jesus answers more so the second question, the end times question. So we see kind of an end times prophecy. So let's go ahead and start reading it in verse 4. Jesus told them, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah.' They will deceive many, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. But all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. And many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all nations will hear it, and then the end will come." Now, this is just the beginning of the prophecy that Jesus is going to share. But I want to pause here for a second and kind of tell you the two schools of thought on interpreting this prophecy. One thought is that Jesus is prophesying the destruction of the temple in AD 70, and that all of this that he shares, all the woe and all the destruction and all the pain and suffering, is referring specifically to what will happen in AD 70 when the Roman Empire comes in and destroys a large part of Jerusalem, and specifically the temple. So that's one school of thought. The other school of thought is that Jesus it was talking about the end times, like the end times with the tribulation and the Antichrist and everything that will happen during the end times, the true end times that haven't occurred even yet. So let me go back to the AD 70 just for a little while and kind of explain what happened. So in AD 70, you have the Jewish people were upset with the Romans because the Romans jacked up the taxes. So they elevated the taxes to what the Jews thought was an extreme amount. And there was a slight rebellion. There was a little revolt that happened as a result of that. And when that happened, when they revolted and caused a little bit of destruction, I think even a couple of deaths, the Romans decided to teach them a lesson and make a statement, and they killed over 3,000 Jewish people as punishment for that little revolt. Well, killing 3,000 people in Jerusalem did not go over well. And so there was actually a real rebellion, an organized revolt. And as a result, the Jewish people actually got control of the Jerusalem, kicked out the Romans, killed thousands of soldiers, and held on to the city themselves, which brought the Roman army in large part to come and lay siege to Jerusalem. And so that siege lasted quite a while, but eventually the Romans were able to break into the city and wreak destruction and killed thousands and thousands of people. Most of our information about this whole war, this whole scene, this whole siege comes from the historian Josephus. Now, Josephus was a Roman historian who was actually a Jew. He was a Jewish traitor. He basically his life was in danger, and he decided that it was a good time to go ahead and jump ship and go over to the Roman side. So he became the historian for the Romans. And so he says that over 1.1 million people died during this scene. It was large spread havoc and destruction. Most of those deaths occurred because of a fire in the temple. So the Roman soldiers set the temple on fire, burned it to the ground with lots of people inside of it, and the stampeding caused by the fire led to many, many more deaths. Now, a lot of scholars question Josephus's numbers. They also question his motivation, especially because he was trying to kind of maybe pump up the numbers and make his new conquerors look good. His new owners, his new bosses. And so they question whether there are even 1 million Jews in the city, but up to over 1.1 million people died in this fire and the stampeding and also the famine and the destruction and the siege. So horrible destruction. And then you have the other end of it, the other people who think it can't possibly be from AD 70, but it has to be an end times prophecy, will go back and look at the similarities in Matthew 24 to the similarities they see in Revelation, especially Revelation chapter 13, also in Daniel chapter 9, and then also in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So they kind of look at those parallels and they believe that. I'm going to continue reading this prophecy, and I'm going to come back and tell you my take on it and why I have that take. So let's continue reading in verse 15. The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills. A person on the deck of a roof must not go down into the house to pack. A person out in the field must not return even to get a coat. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. And pray that your flight will not be in winter or on the Sabbath, for there will be greater anguish than at any time since the world began, and it will never be so great again. In fact, unless that time of calamity is shortened, not a single person will survive, but it will be shortened for the sake of God's chosen ones. Then if anyone tells you, look, here is the Messiah, or there he is, don't believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will rise up and perform great signs and wonders, so as to deceive, if possible, even God's chosen ones. See, I have warned you about this ahead of time. So if someone tells you, look, the Messiah is out in the desert, don't bother to go out and look. Or, look, he is hiding here. Don't believe it. For as the lightning flashes in the east and shines to the west, so it will be when the Son of Man comes. Just as a gathering of vultures shows there is a carcass nearby, so these signs indicate that the end is near. Immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will give no light. The stars will fall from the sky and the powers in heaven will be shaken. And then at last the sign that the Son of Man is coming will appear in the heavens, and there will be deep mourning among all the peoples of the earth. And they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with the mighty blast of a trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from all over the world, from the farthest ends of heaven, of earth and heaven. A lot there, okay? A lot going on. And as I read that part of the prophecy, you can kind of see why there are a number of people that believe that this is an end times prophecy. There just seems to be a lot going on. And so if you've looked at my notes already, then you'll see kind of my take on the whole matter. I am totally against the whole AD 70 philosophy, theology, the idea that this prophecy has to do with what was going on historically in AD 70. I believe it's an end times prophecy, and I'm going to give you a couple of reasons why I do not think it could possibly be a fulfillment of a prophecy for AD 70. And here's the first thing. Jesus describes way too many happenings and calamities for a 40-year period. Jesus describes way too many happenings and calamities for a 40-year period. As if you look at back at the earlier in the chapter, he talks about many false messiahs coming. Now remember, okay, Jesus died around 32 AD, give or take a year. So if he died then, and then the prophecy that people are talking about, this AD 70 as a possibility for this prophecy, then that means just 40 years later, less than 40 years, you have many false messiahs, many wars, many famines, many earthquakes. There's just all widespread persecution. Now, if you actually study the history of the Roman Empire and the rise of Christianity, you will see that Christian persecution didn't start up right after Jesus' death. The only people that were persecuting Christians in the early years right after Jesus' death were actually Jewish people. It wasn't the Roman people. It wasn't until Nero, close to AD 70, but the late 60s, where Nero kind of started the Christian persecution, the widespread persecution of Christians. And so he's talking about worldwide persecution here in chapter 24. Doesn't seem like there would be enough time to develop that kind of persecution. Also, the good news certainly hadn't reached the ends of the earth. If you look back at an earlier verse, it says that the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all nations will hear it, and then the end will come. And it says that in verse 14. Well, Christianity had spread to maybe a little bit of Asia and a little bit of Europe, but it hadn't gone beyond that point. It certainly hadn't gone to the very ends of the earth, and so it seems unlikely that this could also happen before AD 70. Then you have nothing resembling the abomination of desolation. And so that verse, which let's go to that one right now. In verse 15, it says, "The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place." Now this is a prophecy from Daniel, where Daniel says that when the Antichrist comes, that will be the end time, and you will actually see the abomination of desolation, something very sacrilegious set up in the temple of God. And it'll just be blasphemy. And so scholars will try to argue that the Romans came into the temple and put up their insignia, and they put up other Roman symbols, and maybe even had some stuff for the Zeus, their god, or Jupiter. But that's not true. The Jewish people were very sacred about their temple, and they would have never allowed that. There would have been a large-scale revolt much earlier if they had tried to put those kind of things in the temple. So that never happened before the destruction of the temple, and obviously after the destruction of the temple, that didn't happen because it was destroyed. And so there was no object of desolation inside the temple. So again, I can't buy into the AD 70 theory. Also, it makes the point that this time, that this prophecy that Jesus has given, he says that this time will be worse than any time ever before. It will be the most anguish, the most devastating time in the history of the world. And that if it didn't end because of the grace of God early, then no one would survive it. That seems far too extreme for what happened in AD 70 between the Jewish people and the Roman government. 1.1 million people, if that's how many Jewish people died, that is a lot of people. And you have to take that loss of life very seriously. But when you look at all the atrocities that have happened over the history of the world, it's hard to place that one at the very top. Look at the Holocaust. The Holocaust, you have 6 million Jewish people die. And it wasn't an accidental fire that just got out of control and people stampeding. You had people being sent to death camps and turned into skeletons by being worked so hard and obviously going and being killed in large-scale gas chambers and all kinds of horrible experiments and horrible things happening. So comparing the Holocaust to this event, I mean, to me, there's no comparison. And there's other even worse tragedies in the world. If you go outside the Jewish community, Stalin was said to have killed 20 million people over his tenure, and Mao from the Chinese emperor killed upwards of 60 million people. So you just see greater genocides. You also see more horrible time periods than this one in AD 70. So to hold on to that AD 70 theory that Jesus was just prophesying for that and this wasn't an end times prophecy, to me undermines Jesus' words and undermines his truth and his accuracy and his knowledge of the future. The final one for me that just is the stake in the coffin is, I'm pretty sure Jesus didn't come back in AD 70. So he very clearly says that he is going to come back out in the clouds, come back like lightning and reveal himself and make things right, and then he's going to kind of reap the righteous and separate the righteous from the unrighteous. That couldn't possibly happen in AD 70. We're still waiting Jesus to come back. And so again, I very much believe that this is the end times prophecy, and he's revealing to us what's going to happen later on, some of the signs that we need to be looking for if the end times are near. And of course, you can see some of these things, and of course, some of them have not happened yet, but these are things that we need to take to heart. And there are going to be people, there's going to be false messiahs, there's going to be people claiming to have the truth and not have the truth, and we have to use a lot of discernment to understand these things. All right, I want you to look at the next part of my notes, which is, let's take some lessons from Matthew 24. My first point here, even before I keep reading, is this one. Believing in the AD 70 interpretation may seem reasonable, but it reeks of skepticism. Believing in the AD 70 interpretation may seem reasonable, but it reeks of skepticism. As I think you probably already gathered, I feel pretty strongly about this one, about the AD 70 interpretation of this passage being wrong. But the reason why I feel so strongly about it is not because I think I just have really good facts, and it's not so much about that as I'm concerned the motive behind believing that Jesus is prophesying only for the Jewish people and only about what was going to happen in AD 70. Because most of the people who espouse that theory believe that Matthew was written at a later time period, written in the 2nd century AD. They also believe that Matthew didn't actually write the book of Matthew, that it was just given that name to add credibility to the book, and that these things were written much later after Christ's death. And so if you believe in the AD 70 interpretation and also believe that Matthew was written in a later time period, then it takes away from the fact that Jesus was a prophet, that he could tell the future, that he actually knew what was going to happen in the future. Because if Matthew is just writing these words, or whoever wrote the book of Matthew was writing these words in the 2nd century AD, they already knew what happened in AD 70. And so you could kind of go through the details of the destruction of what happened in AD 70 and make Jesus look like a prophet. So for me to espouse that theory is to undermine that this book actually was written by Matthew, and it truly was the words of Jesus, and that Jesus truly was a prophet. It also makes Jesus look like maybe he's just a man. So the same people that believe that it's just about AD 70 tend to believe that it was not really written by Matthew, and tend to believe that it was written much later. And if all that's the case, then it makes Jesus just look like a regular man, that he can't predict the future. They're just trying to glorify a regular man and make him greater than he actually was. And that seriously bothers me. That undermines our whole theology, that undermines our entire faith to believe that Jesus was just a man, that he was just a good teacher, just a good guy, and not the Son of God who had foreknowledge of what was going to happen in the future, even end times knowledge. And my question for those scholars who believe that this is AD 70 and that the people writing the book of Matthew were just describing what happened in AD 70 and made Jesus look like he was telling prophecy, why were the writers of this book not more specific? If you look at the prophecies in Daniel, they are so specific that it's almost like the retelling of the war. Like this leader did this, and this leader did this, and this back and forth action describes exactly how the battle went. But this prophecy of Jesus is so vague. In fact, it refers over and over, it refers a couple of times to famines and earthquakes, but never says anything about a fire. But the destruction of the temple had most to do with a great fire and a stampede. So why would that not be wrapped up into this prophecy if this prophecy is only about the destruction of the temple in AD 70? Again, it's just weak. And so I just don't believe it. But let's keep reading this chapter because there's a couple other lessons I want to pull from this chapter. We're going to take it back up with our reading in verse 32. Now learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you can know his return is very near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will disappear, but my words will never disappear. Here is my second point that I want to share with you. We are part of a kingdom that will not disappear before Christ returns. We are part of a kingdom that will not disappear before Christ returns. Again, this passage has some controversy over it because they look at these words of Jesus and say that this kingdom, this generation will not pass away until these things happen. And that's why some believers want to shove in this theory that Jesus' prophecy is only talking about AD 70, the destruction of the temple in AD 70, because they don't want to make Jesus out to be a liar or that Jesus was clueless about what was actually going to happen. Because otherwise, what is Jesus talking about here? If this generation that he's talking to will not pass away before these events happen, well, that could be true if you're talking about AD 70, because some of these people that were listening to him could still be alive during that point. But if you're talking about end times and you're talking about Jesus' return, well, all these people he's talking to are surely dead. And so that's not true. But I'm pointing out that what Jesus was talking about was way over their heads. What he was talking about with this generation will not pass away. He was not talking about the men and women listening to him right then and there in their lives. He was talking about the kingdom that his death and resurrection was bringing to the earth. The kingdom that he's talking about is the church, that he was going to pave the way for the church, and that generation was not going to pass away until the end times came. Very interesting, again, going back to the book of Daniel. I almost need to do a study of the book of Daniel to kind of coincide with this one chapter in Matthew. But if you look in the book of Daniel, there's an end times prophecy that talks about 70 weeks. So there's 69 weeks that predict to the very day when Christ, the Messiah, would arrive into Jerusalem for Passover. It's fascinating. You could actually look at the dates when all this stuff happened and mark it down to the very day. All right. But Daniel does this weird thing where he does that prediction of 69 weeks, and then there's a clear break between 69 weeks and 70th week. And then he talks about the 70th week, and all the stuff that he's talking about in the 70th week is clearly hasn't happened yet. It's a clear end times prophecy. Tribulation, Antichrist, the abomination of desolation, all these things that are going on in the 70th week. So 69 weeks to get to Christ, and then 70th week to get to this last 7-year period of the end of the world. What is going on there? Well, I believe that the church, the entire church age, all 2,000 years that the church has been in existence and has been the vehicle that Christ has chosen to spread the gospel and get and expand his kingdom, that church is a generation that Jesus is speaking to right in this passage of 24. We fit in between week 69 and week 70. Daniel is doing a prophecy for the Jewish people. It's his people that are held captive by the Babylonians. It's his people that he is addressing. And there's 69 weeks of a prophecy for the Jewish people, for the waiting for the Messiah. And then the Jewish people, shortly after Jesus was killed, are scattered. They're destroyed by this temple destruction in AD 70 and the persecution by the Roman Empire. So they don't exist as a nation again until the late 1940s, where Israel becomes a nation again. So that's why a lot of people are thinking we're near the end times prophecies, because for the first time in 2,000 years, there's an Israelite nation where the prophecy of Daniel could occur. So I believe that the entire church age is in between the 69th and 70th week, and I believe we won't be here for the tribulation. I think that Jesus is coming back and going to rapture the church, the people that have the Holy Spirit inside them and that believe in Jesus, and that the last week, the 70th week, the week of tribulation, and all the things that are going to happen with the Antichrist are going to be when we're not here. And that is what Jesus was referring to when this kingdom will not pass away until I return. So that's my take on it. There are people that disagree, but study the word for yourself and see what you believe. All right, but let me finish out this chapter now. All right, verse 36. However, no one knows a day or hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself. Only the Father knows. When the Son of Man returns, it will be like it was in Noah's day. In those days before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up into the time Noah entered his boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. 2 men will be working together in the field. One will be taken, the other left. 2 women will be grinding flour at the mill. One will be taken, the other left. So you too must keep watch, for you don't know what day your Lord is coming. Understand this, if a homeowner knew exactly when a burglar was coming, he would keep watch and not permit his house to be broken into. You also must be ready all the time, for the Son of Man will come when least expected. A faithful, sensible servant is one to whom the master can give responsibility of managing his other household servants and feeding them. If the master returns and finds that the servant has done a good job, there will be a reward. I tell you the truth, the master will put that servant in charge of all he owns. But what if the servant is evil and thinks, my master won't be back for a while? And he begins beating the other servants, partying and getting drunk. The master will return unannounced and unexpected, and he will cut the servant to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Intense stuff. When I was in high school, I had a good friend who had a weekend job. It was a pretty sweet gig. He would clean this office building for this Christian organization. So it was a very conservative Christian organization, but he would go there on the weekends, usually late at night, and clean the offices and get paid a decent sum of money. And it was relaxing because there was no time limit or pressing issue. He could just go there whenever he wanted over the weekend, as long as it was done before the weekend was over. Well, he had a serious girlfriend at the time, and he decided that to kind of pass the time away, he would bring his girlfriend along and have her help him clean the office building. And as you can imagine, completely empty office building, no one there, late at night. Often one thing would lead to another, and there'd be some serious making out happening at the office building. But it was no big deal because no one ever came there late at night, right? Now, that he was aware that there was a possibility that one of the people that worked there, or one of the people that owned the place, could come in late at night and retrieve something, but the likelihood of it was just not very likely, and so why not take the risk? Well, one night, as they had just kind of put some articles of clothing back on and were out there, playing, out there cleaning the building, the owner of the building showed up. It was late at night, probably 10 o'clock, opened up. They were able to kind of frantically look like they were cleaning before he saw them, but he saw a young guy, a young girl, alone at the office building at night. They probably looked a little disheveled, and that was the end of him working there. Later that week, he was fired. So this buddy of mine knew that there was the possibility that someone could show up. In his mind, all right, head knowledge, he knew that that was a possibility. But in his heart of hearts, he never believed it would happen, and so he did not prepare for it, and he got busted. Jesus is making it very clear here. There's a possibility that I can come back at any time. You have to be ready. And this is my last point. No one knows when Christ will return, but we need to be ready. No one knows when Christ will return, but we need to be ready. And for a lot of people, we know, head knowledge, mentally, that it's possible that Jesus could come back right now, today. The rapture could occur. We know that, but in our heart of hearts, we don't believe that. And as a result, we don't live like that. So many of us are not truly ready. Some of us are not truly ready to the point where we've never accepted Jesus as our Savior and truly made the step to start following him with our whole heart. We may go to church, we may even be part of a life group, we may even give some on Sunday mornings, but in our hearts, we have not fully embraced the Holy Spirit, Jesus' forgiveness, repentance, all those things. We have not truly turned our life over to Christ and become one of his. And that's a scary thought because Jesus can come back at any time. And if we're not ready, what Jesus says about the servants who are unprepared and are not ready, he calls them evil. And he says that he will cast them out into outer darkness if we're not ready. And even for the ones that have maybe punched our tickets to the afterlife with Jesus, we are following him, but maybe mentally and spiritually, we're not prepared to meet our Heavenly Father and hear, "Well done, my good and faithful servant." Maybe we have bought into the life of Christ, but have not truly given our lives over and are serving him. What a shame. What a shame to have to face Jesus and not be ready. What a shame to have to face Jesus and know that we had so many friends and relatives that we had never shared the gospel with because we thought, well, we have another day or they have another day. All the things that we could have done to give and to serve, and we just didn't do it because we thought, well, I'm busy now. I'll do it another day. And all of us, if we knew the exact date when Jesus would come back, if we knew that it was next week, we would stop all the extraneous things that we were doing now, and we would focus on whatever we could do to win more people for him and to do more for him and to show how faithful we are if we knew he was coming back soon. And he tells us to live like that always. So my challenge for you tonight is to live like that always. In your mind, think Jesus can come back at any time and I want to be ready. I want to be in a frame of mind and in an action state where I know if Jesus comes back, I would be happy to see him. I'd be happy to hear what he would have to say to me when I do see him. And if we can live like that, then we'll be set. All right, so that wraps up chapter 24. Next week is chapter 25. Please read ahead, and I'll see you guys next week.